Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of our podcast. My name is Nate Marble. I'm the HR director here at Discovery Ranch South, and I'm sitting here with Jen Hedrick, the clinical director and associate executive director here at the ranch. Today we are going to be discussing the social challenges, social integration, and strategies for success for ASD and neurodivergent kids. And especially as it relates to girls. Please remember this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. If there's something you need help with, seek mental health professional for your individual situation. This episode, we want to delve, like I said, into the social challenges faced by teenage girls with ASD, ND, and offer some practical strategies to help them develop social skills and friendships. So, let's just dive right in.
Okay,
how you
sounds
doing,
good.
Jen? You doing okay today?
Yeah,
Good,
great.
good.
Thank you.
So, our last episode, we talked about kind of the definition and how to be aware of what's happening with your kids, especially if they are neurodivergents. This time, I think we want to delve more into why. Why is it difficult for teenage girls with neurodivergence to socially integrate? Why is it difficult? What causes it to be hard? Mm-hmm. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yeah. I think really it comes back to, navigating just the social world in general, right? And we tend to see more often diagnoses of teenage girls at a later age. So, they might go 12. 12 is kind of a number I think I keep using, and I think that's just because that's when the school structure changes, and so that's when we tend to see like navigation issues occur, and so it comes back to like social hierarchy, right? The script changes, and so these kids have maybe they have not learned that script, and it doesn't come necessarily naturally based on some of the challenges that the neurodivergent brain might face. I think social norms in general. I'm smiling because some of the kids I've worked with, I feel like they'll challenge a lot of social norms. And like on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, go challenge the social norm. But on the other hand, it's not a great way to socially integrate, right? So if you're constantly challenging social norms, you're not going to integrate very well. I think that just in like interpretation, like social interpretation in general can be challenging for some of these kids. And so, they like some of the modalities, I'm just going to jump into that just briefly and say like some of that would be to kind of like take time to observe that and learn, back to this social thinking piece. Like that is where the big challenge occurs. It's not with social, we often say they can't socially integrate because they don't have social skills. That's actually the icing on the top. They're struggling because they don't have the social thinking necessarily. They have not mastered social thinking. And so we have to kind of take a step back and look at the social thinking piece and how do they, it's kind of like, when you hear someone say, read the room, Nate, like read the room. Yeah. Not that you have a problem with that, but that's kind of what it is, right? Is like first read the room. So learn to think socially about what is happening right now in this moment. And so that's why the struggle is there, is because we've got to start from the beginning.
How do you help them do that? Because that's not a typical thing for a kid to do, is to walk into a room and say, I see what's going on here and I want to be able to integrate into all of this. How do you help them? Are there tools that you can help them do that? Do you just point it out to them? What do they do?
Well, I think it comes back to, like I used it in the first episode. We talked a little bit about looking at the first piece, which is what kind of sensory experience is that kid having? So literally what is going on inside of their body, right? What are they experiencing in their nervous system? And then that leads to what emotional experience are they having? And then what awareness do they have around those two things? And then we can kind of go into the bigger stuff, which is like, then we can maybe teach social skills. So it's like, if I walk into a crowded room where a lot of people are talking, right, I might have to adjust a little bit. Like I might have to go, oh, this is like overstimulating, so I need to adjust a little bit. So a kid who's on the autism spectrum or neurodivergent, they might have to do more of that, right? To like kind of just ultimately navigate the sensory piece. So what we're seeing is a lack of social integration is often that we haven't looked at step one, which is what's going on sensory wise for this kid. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's because I'm kind of a geek about body language. I mentioned I was the performing arts director, right?
Yeah.
So is this something that it's not inherent to them? They wouldn't walk in and say, I can tell that guy's mad right now. Or this guy that's talking to me right now has a very hyper attitude or is very anxious. They don't see that, correct? So are there cues that they can look for with all of that? Do you teach them to look for those cues?
So I want to come back. I do think they see it, but is the question is how is it interpreted?
The interpretation,
right?
of
So
it.
I think the interpretation is what we're talking about. And really, like when you think about nonverbals, verbals, and body language, all of that combined, like the majority of communication is in nonverbals and body language, right? And so we have to kind of like ultimately. You do have to teach that piece. And some of that I think is behind the scenes, right? So like if we're going into therapeutic stuff, we'll say like with an individual therapist or with a parent or it like one of the things I really like to do is do therapy in the environment that the kid is living in. So like here I would do it in the cabin and be able to like stand back and actually do some social observing and make inferences and then check to see if our inferences are correct about what's happening in the social situation.
Could there be a tendency to hyperfixate on that stuff for these kids? Hyperfixate on like what that person is doing in this
for
instance
sure.
and why that?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about everybody else, but what about them? What are some common social cues that might be happening with them or might be missed by other people for teenage girls with ASD?
Yeah. And again, I think it depends on the kid, right? What kind of culture they were raised in with their family. I mean, I use one example like, teasing is, I think, a good example of like, that's how, some people show affection and love is through teasing. Some families are like that. But if a kid, doesn't have that background, then they might misinterpret teasing and might actually overinterpret it like as it's like bullying or underinterpret it possibly too. So like some level of teasing that may end up being in sort of like a harassing way or a bullying way. So some kids might underinterpret it as well. So I think it's like it really is trying to find that balance of like just understanding what is happening in my social environment. I think facial expressions, can be challenging. In fact, I had a kid I worked with once that I used to she hated it, but I had her like talk to me as she was looking into a mirror to kind of see what her facial expressions were doing. And then I'd have her guess what my facial expressions were doing. And so, they might, like misinterpret eye rolls, misinterpret like just really gestures in general. And so I think it's like coming back to the drawing table and talking about those things. And also, when you're in an environment where you can check the facts on something and say like, hey, were you upset right there? Like what was happening? I mean, that's best case scenario is that you can actually check the facts in the moment.
Being with them in the moment and saying what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Or being able to step aside.
Yeah. I think another a social cue that's challenging, that is around sort of just communication in general, especially conflict, where kids, neurodivergent kids might end up like being like either too passive or too assertive, and the assertive becomes and is interpreted by others as kind of aggressive, like, standing my ground kind of thing. So it's interesting because as we're talking about this, I think in general, lots of humans struggle with this stuff, right? That's like the nuances of social communication. And a lot of times the neurodivergent brain kind of just has an added challenge around this social integration piece.
So also we've talked about one, but are there other common social challenges that they face, other than just kind of reading the room or seeing where people are at, that the teenage girls face in a neurotypical community? Are there other challenges that we should be looking for? That they should be looking for?
I think friendships are, typically kids want friends, at least one friend, right? And I think navigating that can be challenging. I'm gonna add the social media piece in right now, because I do think that creates, just like it creates kind of an altered reality of how I now am learning about what is friendship when it's actually not necessarily friendship. And so I think it's like teaching, and parents, this is where parents come in, right? Is like, hopefully parents are one of the greatest resources for these kids, which is like, how do you teach about friends? Like, what is a close friend? What is a good friend? What is a basic friend? What is an acquaintance? What is a respectful
What are they doing to show you that they are the close friend?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And I think that's kind of common in developmentally for kids anyway, but I do think kids who are neurodivergent may struggle with this a little bit more in terms of navigating friendship. So there's got to be a lot of education around that. And with the social media piece being kind of an interference there, it causes problems.
So how important is it to teach those social cues and help them understand that earlier rather than later? I mean, we talked about being diagnosed earlier rather than later, and usually it's later with girls. But if you do get that diagnosis earlier, how important is it to teach those social skills early compared to later?
So again, I'm just going to come back to the social skills piece is the last piece, right? It's more about like all the things before that, and teaching, how do I manage my sensory experience? How do I manage my emotional regulation? How do I develop awareness? And then we can go into the social skills. Like that's like step 4. And then executive functioning is at the end, right? Like now I have all of that, I can organize my life. But we tend to do it out of order. And that's where problems occur, is that we're trying to teach algebra before basic math is known.
Yeah. I think about I have a cousin that I went on a camping trip 2 years ago, and he's 42-ish, and he just came out and said, I think I've had ASD, I've never been, so he's 42 years old, he got to that point, he's like, I'm going to go to the doctor and make sure, see what happens, see if it's an actual diagnosis, but he did not have those tools, and it was probably very hard for him through that whole time.
Yeah.
Okay, so talking about friendships, you talked a little bit about friendships and how what are good friends and all of that stuff. What is there a good way to promote these kids to have decent and strong friendships, and how do you promote that and urge them to do that?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, because I think that even though I think we are seeing a shift in the neurotypical world of more like affirming neurodivergent kids, and education around this, I do think that it can be challenging. I just want to point this out really quick, that this term that gets thrown out a lot is the term socially awkward, right? Like you've heard that, and I know I've probably used it many times in my life, of this person is just kind of socially awkward. And I kind of find that interesting, because I'm like, according to who, right? Like according to who are they socially awkward? And so I think kids who are neurodivergent get called that a lot. They get called socially awkward. And the reality is like, my question is, according to who, right? Well, according to this neurotypical world that we live in, that says there's these expectations and these social norms that you have to fit into. And so I think it's like helping, ultimately, again, balancing, here are all your strengths, kid we're talking to, here are all your strengths, like let's help you capitalize on those strengths, and then let's look at some of the things that maybe you do in the world that don't get the results that you want. My mom told me to quit swearing or I wouldn't have friends, and She was wrong, but just kidding. No, but I'm just saying, like, I think that all of us probably learn to kind of modify our behavior, adapt, right, a little bit in relationships. And yet we don't want to like completely change and bend to the will of somebody else. But I think that it is like helping that kid understand, like, you don't have to change who you are. And if you want these friendships, like, let's look at how you're showing up in those friendships, right? You know, it's like, do you know how to take turns in that relation? I'm thinking of kids I've worked with where they're like, I don't have any friends. And I'm like, well, it's because you don't take turns in the way that, you know, you don't turn take with them. You don't reciprocate stuff. You know, you the perspective taking tends to be off a little bit, right? So there's like this hyper egocentrism where they're just like, it's all about me. It's all about me. And they can't see outside of themselves. Or they care too much, right? So there's this kind of like what would get labeled in psychology as like codependent. So they like they're over caring for this person and then taking on those emotions. And so, I mean, they're just challenges in general, I think, that anybody could have. But looking at that individual, you know, what do you need? What do you want? You want friendships. Let's look at what's working and what's not working. I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to.
Well, and ultimately that would have to translate into other aspects, like a work relationship, right? I mean, do you find that it's more frustrating with kids having to move between all these different types of relationships, the friendship, the work relationship, the whatever else here at school, a teacher or a principal they're going to?
Yeah.
Is it, do neurodivergent kids usually look at all those relationships the same way and try to relate to them the same way? Or are they able to kind of compartmentalize and go, okay, I'm going into the principal's office now. I need to speak with this guy just a little bit different.
Yeah, I think they're actually really good at that. I think they have the ability to be really good at that. That's sort of where, like, when you look at rigidity, like in the neurodivergent brain, like where it can be a strength and something that's challenging as well. And that's where the strength is that they are able to create scripts, create compartments, and almost like sort of a little bit of black and white rules around things for themselves that work, right? Like that's kind of that starting point is that, you know, they learn, and again, like they're learning, one of the ways they learn is through modeling. And so hopefully parents and caregivers and support people in this kid's life are doing really good modeling of the social piece that we want, the social integration. A mom who's looking at her phone all the time is not doing a great job, like helping this kid learn to navigate the social world. So yeah, I do think that they can actually be very good at that.
I was actually coaching a kid actor. He was 16, who had ASD. And he explained it to me like I have filing cabinets in my head. So if I was giving him a coaching, some kind of coaching, he would say, "Hold on, let me pull that filing cabinet up," and he would pull up the filing cabinet. So that was a good way, I think, for him to
totally,
I guess, deal with help him work through that. But
and I think that that's like the starting point, and then over time as the kid matures, right, and they can soften that, I guess, a little bit, loosen up, be a little more flexible. But at the beginning, that's okay. That's great. I think that's great, like to be able to be rigid and to have those scripts and rules in place and adjust, you know, and then learn to adjust kind of accordingly over time. And maturity in the brain is going to help with that anyway.
So how does that translate into positive self-image or self-esteem going through those relationships and learning how to do all of that? Is that something that's forefront on their mind, or is that kind of a back burner thing, positive self-image and self-esteem?
I think it depends on what's valued. I mean, again, it comes back to the individual and that experience, you know. ASD kids are not, you know, if you've met one, you haven't met all of them. That's like they're all very different. But I think that, you know, self-esteem is actually like if we struggle with self-esteem, it's actually a struggle with self-compassion. So it's kind of the way we look at it anyway, is how are we compassionate or not compassionate towards ourselves? And so, I think it's really what is what is valued, right? Like, some kids are able to sort of like put, like almost like put a block on that and be like, I don't care. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And just because as the parent, I'm saying, but like, it should matter. Like, you should care about that, right? So it's again, like, what is their lived experience? How do they feel about themselves? And really diving into that. And then kind of, again, deciphering, is it self-esteem or is it compassion towards self? Because we often like, we say self-esteem, but really it's like, how do you feel? How are you towards yourself? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison between the two. I haven't heard it that way, so that's new for me. Mm-hmm. That's something that I think I could take, like with any parent, I guess you could take that into your life with your kids. Mm-hmm. Like my daughter that went through, hated middle school.
Yeah.
But what was your self-compassion in that moment instead of what does your self-esteem look like, and what do you attach that to? Do neurodivergent kids usually have a way of it? Do they attach, like my daughter attaches it to the friends that she has and what she's getting back from them? Mm-hmm. Is that something that neurodivergent kids do? They attach it to the relationships they have, their self-esteem and self-worth compared. Do they attach that to kids that they're having relationships with?
So I think what you're asking, I'm going to answer it the way I think you're asking it, which is like, what impacts their self-esteem, right? Like, and so I think it is really, I think that is kind of the teenage experience in general, is what impacts a kid's esteem for themselves, or whether they're compassionate or not compassionate towards themselves, really depends on what is valued in their life and what is important in their life, right? And if they can be strengths-based. And I think that's where we run into problems with our neurodivergent kids, is that, again, they're told, like, you should be like this, you're not doing this well, like, can you just do it this way? So trying to fit them into a neurotypical world. And so then they're developing these mental health issues that are creating, more problems for themselves. And then those mental health issues that I think in turn, they do kind of end up they can feel bad about themselves.
So the shoulds get in there.
For sure.
The shoulds really don't exist.
Absolutely fit the social expectation of what the world thinks you're supposed to be like. Are
there other support systems that parents or kids can seek out for help or support in this realm? Like, if they're struggling with that, where could they go? What could they do? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, well, the internet is like this whole world, right? Yeah. It is. Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you talk to, I would probably go with one person first and just like, start kind of building the community that way, right? And asking questions of someone you might know, a therapist I would use as an example. But I'm just going to mention two because they're two that I found really helpful in terms of education for myself, education for the kids I work with, and there's tons of parenting resources as well. One of them is called Asperger Experts, and it was a community that was driven by a young adult actually who is on the autism spectrum and went to treatment as a young adult, and so it's one that I love and that I think was built by him. It's directed by him. He does a lot of the kind of educating and information dissemination. But I think just asking questions, looking online. There's so much. I think that's where people get kind of overwhelmed. If you did a search right now, I mean, we'd find a million hits, and so it's hard to kind of figure out what's. So that's why I'm thinking, like, start small. Like one person, two people. Talk to educators, talk to therapists, talk to educational consultants. I mean, there's no shortage of help, I think.
Yeah, resources out there.
Yeah.
So on that line, are there any types of therapies that have been shown to effectively help ASD or ND teenagers for that social interaction?
Yeah. So there's actually, the ones that there's, we could just say therapy in general is great, but I do think there's like specific things. So, finding a therapist that does maybe have some background in the social thinking part that I keep talking about, which is actually comes from a woman named Michelle Garcia Winner, who developed this aspect of social thinking that we use here at the ranch as well. So I think anyone with background in social thinking, honestly, speech therapists are super helpful too, because they will integrate those nuances that we were talking about with a kid. They will talk about like body language, facial, facial expressions, gestures, things like that. Like they'll do work with that kid specifically around that. Occupational therapy can be really helpful. That's where the sensory stuff comes in. So occupational therapists can help kids just, learn to like really navigate either overstimulation or understimulation. And social groups, I think, like, just if you're going to like throw the icing on the cake again, like with the social skills piece, I think, helping kids put things into practice by being in social groups, which is a risk, but change is always risky, right? Like growth is always risky. And so if the kid is motivated to, have better social integration, then we need to kind of encourage them to take those risks.
So the risk, go into the risk of that. Like we know that could be overstimulating or whatever, but putting them into a social group that they might not, it might be a stretch for them. Go into the risk of that a little bit. If you know.
Well, I hope first we pick a social group, but maybe it's connected to something that they like, right? So there's some connection, there's already a shared interest there. So the risk is decreased at that point, because if it's a Dungeons and Dragons group, they have a shared interest, right? And so you're going to have that. Or if it's a rock climbing group, they have a shared interest. So if you create it with a shared interest, you're going to decrease the risk of, like the social integration being going wrong, which is still going to be challenging. I think it's challenging for any kid, but I think neurodivergent kids are just going to have a little more complication there.
Great. So do you have an experience? I mean, obviously we have experiences with kids every day here on the ranch, but is there anything that pops out in your mind about a kid that maybe wasn't originally in the social mind frame of it, but was able to work through that with you?
Yeah. I have a kid comes to mind right now I worked with here about a year and a half ago. This was a kid. I'm always smiling when I think about the hard things, because they're just such growth opportunities for me too as a therapist. But I had a kid who was probably like intelligence wise way smarter than me. And so their logic was always airtight around things. And so interestingly, in the community, a lot of our staff would end up getting into a lot of power struggles with this kid. And part of that was because they could logic their way out of anything. You would not win. No one would win, right? And so I had to educate myself on not engaging in that power struggle with them, and kind of allowing them just to like have that, right? And then also with the staff. But the specific thing comes to mind where they were out on doing an outing, and not in this kid's history to like steal, but they did steal a piece of candy, like a small piece of candy from the store, and found out, actually, I think they told on themselves, which was fitting also, right? It's kind of this rule stuff. But when I talked to them about it, I was like not focusing on like, that's wrong. Like, what did you do that? It was more like, what was going on for you? Like what came up for you? Why did you say it? And we ended up in this really interesting discussion around kind of like moral development, because they said it was really small. It didn't matter. Right. Like, and so it was this idea of like, if it's small, it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, what we got to was just that, again, this impacted everybody, right? Even this small little choice this choice to steal a small piece of candy impacted everyone, because now it's like, we can't go out and you can't steal, right? We don't want kids to steal when we're out and about. So it took, honestly, several weeks to kind of like talk through the social piece of that, and how their choice impacted everyone they were with, and ultimately impacted, kind of a level of trust that went along with taking them out off campus. So, but they were using logic, right? It was sort of this like maybe lower level of moral development and logic to sort of like say it's really not that big of a deal because they weren't thinking about it socially.
So do ASD kids tend, I mean, is morally, you said morally ambiguous. I don't know if that was the word you used, but talking about morals, is it black and white with these kids? There's this huge gray section, it seems like.
Yeah.
So do they take those files from those filing cabinets and say, hey, is this something that is a moral? Like, go into morals with these kids with ASD.
Yeah, so I'm just like, I'm referring to like moral development in general, like of teenagers. And so, and I think there's not necessarily a connection that I know of between like a lower development of moral development that is adolescent appropriate and an ASD brain. I haven't seen that. Okay. I think it's just I think it's teenagers in general and the individual experience on how they're developing, and that,
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So in this, we've talked a lot about social communication, integration, in this episode, and I appreciate that. Again, I'm talking with Jen Hedrick. She's the clinical director and associate executive director here at Discovery Ranch South. Appreciate your time again today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, so in our next episode, we're going to talk about some of the common challenges in parenting a teenage girl with ASD and ND. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks.